We now have a second patient in the United States who has contracted Ebola on U.S. soil. So we had the one guy who came in from Africa. He had Ebola. He passed away. Now it turns out 2 nurses who were treating him now have the Ebola virus. We found out about a 26-year-old nurse yesterday, and today we find out about a new nurse who has Ebola. This does not look good. Now let me give you some of the details. CDC says an additional healthcare worker testing positive for Ebola is a serious concern. You don't say. Yeah, I also think it's a serious concern. Look, there's one of 2 problems here. One is that it is spreading in a way that they were not really clear about with us. So they say it's not airborne, and I mean, I don't think all of the scientists are lying. I don't think all the doctors are lying, right? But perhaps it's spreading in a way that we don't quite fully understand yet. Now that's the less likely of the 2 scenarios, so don't panic yet, okay? The other possibility is that our preparedness in terms of how to treat the patients was not quite up to snuff. So that's the more likely scenario, as you'll see in the rest of the quotes here. Dr. Tom Friedman, who is the CDC director, says, "We could have sent a more robust hospital infection control team and been more hands-on with the hospital from day one about exactly how this should be managed." Yeah, that kind of seems obvious in hindsight. I wish that when you had heard that a patient with Ebola had arrived in a hospital in Dallas, that you sent everything you had at your disposal to make sure that he was treated properly for the purpose of protecting the rest of the community, let alone the patient. He also said, "I wish we had put a team like this on the ground the day the first patient was diagnosed. That might have prevented this infection." Now look, he's faced a lot of unfair criticism and people saying that he should resign, and how did they let Ebola get into the country? What were they supposed to do? I mean, the guy, at some point, over 4,000 people have already died from Ebola. It has spread to many countries, Spain, here, etc., right? Because that's what happens. People who are sick at some point get on a plane. Now, if you try to bottle it up, for reasons we've explained in the past, it actually would be counterproductive. So the head of the CDC can't prevent the guy from coming here. But should they have sent the team immediately as soon as they found out he was there? Of course they have these go teams. That would have been the time to go. So there is some legitimate criticism on that front now, okay? Now, when you talk to the nurses, the National Nurses United Executive Director, Roseanne DeMauro, says, quote, "They're not prepared." Now, again, fair and unfair criticism here. Now, is it fair to say we did not prepare every nurse in the country for how to handle Ebola immediately, and so that's wrong? Well, that sounds a little unfair to me. I mean, it depends on the situation, and, there was just one patient in Dallas. Before that, it hadn't even arrived here. Should every nurse in the country be an expert on Ebola? Not necessarily. But the minute that you have the patient in Dallas, should you have briefed the living hell out of every single person working at that hospital as to exactly how to treat that patient and how to contain it? Of course you should. Of course, right? So I'm not getting the sense here from the facts on the ground that they did as good a job on that as they should have, to say the least. I mean, there are 2 people infected now, 2 nurses. That's a tragedy, okay? So now you go to the nurses union again. Associated Press explains, based on statements from nurses, it did not identify. The union described how Duncan, that's the original patient, was left in an open area of the emergency room for hours. It said staff treated Duncan for days without the correct protective gear. That hazardous waste was allowed to pile up to the ceiling, and safety protocols constantly changed. Now, boy, man, there's a lot of bad news in that quote right there. Now, again, it's an anonymous source from the nurses union. They're the most concerned, and understandably so. But if any of those things are true, it's terrible. Now, when the new patients come in, the nurses come in, immediately they're quarantined. We get on top of it, and all the protocols start. And within 90 minutes, they've got the situation contained as best as they can. In the first case, they did not. Now, him sitting in the emergency room as they try to figure out what was going on, in the first case, a little understandable. Not having the proper protocols as you're treating a patient that has Ebola is madness. And if any of that waste piled up anywhere with his bodily fluids on it, the madness of that is unbearable, right? Now, we don't know if the anonymous nurses union talking about waste piling up is the same waste as from the Ebola patient. So let's be a little fair on that. They might be talking about apples and oranges there. But even so, with an Ebola patient in the building, I'd make sure that you got rid of the waste in exactly the right way. Now, more from the nurses. National Nurses United says there was no advanced preparedness on what to do with the patient. There was no protocol. There was no system. The nurses were asked to call the infectious disease department. That does not sound good. Now, finally, we go back to the CDC director. He says, the second patient, as well as the first, had extensive contact with the patient when they were having substantial amounts of both vomiting and diarrhea. Okay. Now, look, that is in some ways good news. Why? Okay. Now, if it turns out they can't figure out why the nurses got Ebola, that's bad news. If they did all the protocol right and they had protective gear on and they got Ebola anyway, that's really bad news. If it turns out that they actually were in significant contact with his bodily fluids and they got Ebola, well, at least we understand why they got Ebola. Now, it's horrible news for them, and they should have had a much better protocol to protect those poor nurses who risked their lives trying to save that guy's life, okay? But in terms of it spreading, if it turns out that they were in contact with significant bodily fluids, at least we understand it better, and you don't need to panic because you're not in contact with their bodily fluids. It's not airborne. You can't get it unless the person is already showing symptoms. But if he was vomiting, etc., and had diarrhea all over the place in that particular case, well, that's your bodily fluids. So at least we understand the problem. And then finally, he says, the assessment of the team is that those in the first several days of the Duncan stay at the hospital, a variety of forms of personal protective equipment were used. Okay, that might also explain it. And in this case, you know, in treating these two new cases of the nurses that are infected, or anywhere else it pops up in the country, let's figure out what protective equipment we have to use and stick with it. Don't change protocols. Don't change, well, maybe you should be in this equipment, maybe you should be in that equipment. Let's figure it out already. Now, look, as I said, you don't have to panic because of all the facts about the disease that I just laid out. On the other hand, don't be too complacent and flippant either. As usual, we got another Dallas native here that was told, oh, one of your neighbors, the second nurse, turns out had Ebola. And he got woken up at 6 in the morning by authorities, as happened in the last case as well. And he said, quote, it's a little scary. It's a little shocking that it's right near me, but I'm not afraid or anything like that. I'm not going to run away. Okay, I know you're from Texas. Just, Ryan, calm down, okay? And we're not asking you to run away or anything like that, but you also don't have to be a tough guy. Reminds me of when AIDS was breaking out, and in Turkey, they went to all the truck drivers, and they're like, stop having sex with the prostitutes unprotected, because you can get AIDS, and AIDS will kill you. There's a saying in Turkey about how something won't affect you. They say, it won't cut me. And the truck drivers are like, we're Turkish. AIDS won't cut us. Turns out that was incorrect. It did cut them. And so don't overly panic. At the same time, do not go anywhere near the bodily fluids of someone who had any chance of being infected with Ebola. Now, look, a lot of people were in contact. Over 70 people were in contact with this patient at the hospital. And obviously, those people were then in contact with other people. Now, none of those people have symptoms yet. If they don't have symptoms, they can't spread the virus anyway. So please find a good middle ground between panic and proper caution.